All right, so I bet you're curious about Fursan al-Aqsa. The game that got banned in the UK caused a whole uproar.
Yeah, quite a bit of controversy.
Yeah, we're going to look into this review of it.
Yeah.
And it gets, pretty interesting. I mean, it's not just about the game itself, but it really goes into the whole, religion and history and Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all that.
Right, yeah. This one is less of like a typical game review you might see. It's more about the reviewer and kind of their whole worldview almost.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
think to really understand where this reviewer is coming from, we have to start with their background.
Yeah.
They identify as an Eastern Christian, which is a really important part of this whole thing.
Right. And that's, for folks who aren't familiar, Eastern Christianity is its own branch of Christianity,
So,
separate from the Catholic and Protestant traditions. Has its own, history and theology. A lot of it's kind of rooted in the Middle East and Eastern Europe.
it just makes you wonder how, different branches of the same faith can have such different interpretations of things.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to something as complicated as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, for sure.
The reviewer also expresses a kind of paradoxical view of Islam. Like they admire certain parts of it. They even reference Ibn Khaldun, a big Islamic scholar. But then they also have, criticisms of the Prophet Muhammad and the religion itself.
Right, yeah. So it's kind of like they respect, some of the intellectual and cultural contributions of Islam. But they also have some pretty fundamental disagreements with kind of the core parts of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that complexity carries over into their view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They say it straight up, they support neither side. They view both Israel and Palestine as hostile to their interests as an Eastern Christian.
Yeah, that's definitely an unusual stance.
It is.
You don't see that too often.
No. Most people, kind of lean one way or the other.
Yeah.
And to understand why they hold this view, I think we need to get into their perspective on the history of the region, right?
Yeah.
They argue that the creation of Israel led to the displacement of Christians from the Holy Land. They even talk about how the demographics of Bethlehem have changed.
Right, yeah. Bethlehem historically has been a majority Christian city.
Yeah.
But, over the last century or so, the Christian population there has shrunk quite a bit.
Yeah.
And they see that change as directly because of the creation of Israel and the displacement of Palestinians, including Christians.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these events, these geopolitical events, have real consequences for people.
Yeah.
Their perspective on Jewish history is really important here, too. They believe that past actions by Jewish people, like the rejection of Jesus and the revolt against Rome, led to their expulsion from the Holy Land, like centuries ago. And they go so far as to say that this history negates any Jewish claim to the land today.
Wow.
That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
And they also question the Wailing Wall.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
They say, so the Wailing Wall is traditionally seen as a remnant of the Second Temple.
Right.
But this reviewer cites a passage from the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus predicts the temple's destruction. And they use that to suggest that the Wailing Wall is actually probably a Roman structure. They think the real Second Temple was completely destroyed, like no trace left. So they're really going against like some pretty fundamental beliefs there.
Yeah, they're definitely challenging some long-held assumptions.
Yeah, it's interesting how, sometimes our own beliefs kind of influence how we see history.
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of challenging assumptions, they bring up the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin.
The Israeli prime minister who was killed in 1995.
Right.
And they call Rabin an anti-Zionist Jew who was really trying to find peace and was willing to compromise.
Okay.
And they view his assassination as this like turning point where Israel, kind of went in a more aggressive direction.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. They even go so far as to say that Israel's founding was based on terrorism. They point to groups like Irgun, Haganah, and Lehi,
Right.
who carried out attacks against Palestinians and British officials.
Right.
So they're drawing a direct line from those acts of violence to what's happening today.
Yeah, so they see like a clear connection there between the past and the present.
So they've painted a pretty, kind of bleak picture so far.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, like, where do they stand on groups like Hamas and Hezbollah?
Yeah.
These organizations that are often labeled as terrorist groups.
Right.
I mean, where do they fall on that? Well, so their views on these groups are complex. Like,
Yeah.
they don't condone the Hamas attack on October 7th. They acknowledge the terrible loss of life and the trauma, but they also try to see, kind of what could lead to that desperation. And they kind of suggest that, Hamas is like a symptom of a bigger problem.
So they're not making excuses for the violence, but they're trying to understand it.
Yeah.
What about Hezbollah?
Okay, so Hezbollah, this is where it gets kind of surprising, maybe. They actually express gratitude to Hezbollah for defending Eastern Christians against ISIS during the Syrian civil war.
Really?
Yeah.
But, I mean, Hezbollah is often considered a terrorist organization.
And absolutely. And they're aware of that. They know, how Hezbollah is seen, and they even admit there's probably some propaganda involved. But they point out that Hezbollah has Christian members.
Oh, okay.
Like, specifically, they mention Armenians. And they also compare Hezbollah's actions to a recent video showing IDF soldiers kind of vandalizing a church in Lebanon.
Huh.
So they're kind of saying, like, look at how both sides are acting and how we're judging them.
Okay, so they're giving us a very different view of Hezbollah than what we usually hear.
Right.
They're focusing on their protection of Christians in the region, even if it means, kind of being on the side of a group with a controversial reputation.
Right. And I think this complicated view of Hezbollah, combined with their historical take on the whole region, I think that helps us understand their stance on Fursan al-Aqsa itself.
Yeah, we're already getting into some pretty thought-provoking stuff here. I mean, we've just started to scratch the surface of this reviewer's worldview.
Right.
And it's clear that they're bringing a very unique and often controversial perspective to all this. I can't wait to hear more about how this all connects to their review of the game itself. We'll be back in part 2 to dig deeper into this fascinating analysis.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we're back, and we're digging deeper into this unusual review of Fursan al-Aqsa, this game that's stirred up so much controversy.
And remember last time we talked about the reviewer's background, right? Especially how their beliefs as an Eastern Christian really shaped their whole view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, they're coming at this from an angle we don't usually hear, which is what makes this whole analysis so interesting. And you know what? They actually bought the game just because it was banned in the UK.
Almost like act of defiance.
Yeah, like they saw the ban as an attempt to silence a certain narrative, the Palestinian perspective that they feel needs to be heard, even if it makes people uncomfortable.
Right. They want to make sure those voices aren't shut down.
Exactly. So now we get to the big question. How does the game actually portray the conflict? They describe it as this spectacle of violence against Israeli forces, and they emphasize how over the top it is.
So they're not shying away from the fact that Fursan al-Aqsa is about fighting against the Israeli military, but they also point out that the game uses humor, so it's not meant to be taken literally.
So are they saying it's okay to show violence in a game as long as it's funny or satirical? I mean, that seems kind of tricky, doesn't it?
Well, it definitely brings up those questions about how we see violence in video games, especially when it's tied to real conflicts. The reviewer thinks the game's absurdity is meant to kind of disarm any potential offense. They argue that the creator made it so exaggerated on purpose to show that it's not supposed to be realistic or a glorification of violence.
I see. So they're saying it's so outrageous it can't be taken seriously as promoting violence, right?
Right.
More like a caricature, a way to make a point rather than a call to action.
Exactly. And they even suggest that if people are offended, it might be because they already have negative views about Palestinians and are looking for reasons to be upset, even in a fantasy setting.
That's a good point. It kind of flips the script, doesn't it? It's suggesting the offense might say more about the person's biases than about the game itself.
It really makes you think about how we react to different kinds of media and the context behind them.
This reviewer is also very aware that Fursan al-Aqsa gives us a very specific Palestinian point of view, something we don't often see in the news, let alone video games.
Right. They acknowledge that even with its exaggerated style, the game offers a window into what it's like to be Palestinian living under Israeli occupation.
To be honest, we don't know much about the game itself. Did the review talk about the mechanics or how it's structured?
Not really. They mostly focused on the overall message and the political side of things. They did mention that the gameplay involves missions where you play as a Palestinian resistance fighter and carry out attacks.
So even without all the details, it's clear that the game puts you in the role of a Palestinian fighter. That's a pretty bold statement on its own, given how sensitive this conflict is.
Definitely. And the reviewer sees this as a sign of the creator's courage and resilience. They see the game as an act of creative expression, a way for the creator to channel their frustrations and perspective into something real, even if it's controversial.
So it's like they're saying that just making this game, despite the potential backlash, is a form of resistance.
Yeah, and they tie that back to their earlier point about Hamas being a symptom of a bigger problem. They're arguing that when people feel like their voices aren't being heard, when they're not given a chance to express their grievances, they might turn to more extreme measures.
So they see the game as an outlet for those frustrations, a way to take back some control and challenge the dominant narrative.
Exactly. And it's interesting how they link this to their own experience as an Eastern Christian. They feel a connection with the creator, seeing a shared struggle against being marginalized and wanting their voices to be heard.
I see. So they're drawing a parallel between the creator's struggle to express a Palestinian perspective through the game and their own struggle to express an Eastern Christian viewpoint in the bigger picture.
Right. And that shared feeling of being marginalized, of being stuck between powerful forces, might be why they connect with the creator of Fursan al-Aqsa on a deeper level, even if they don't necessarily agree with everything in the game or how it portrays violence.
It's complicated, and I think this reviewer is trying to make us think about it in a more nuanced way.
Absolutely. They're challenging us to look beyond the surface, to think about why people make and play games, especially when those games deal with sensitive political and religious topics.
It's a reminder that games can be more than just fun. They can be powerful ways to explore different points of view, challenge what we think we know, and even start conversations about difficult issues.
And even if we don't agree with all of the reviewer's conclusions or the game's message, their perspective makes us confront our own biases and think about the complexities of a conflict that has no easy answers.
Okay, so we've covered how the reviewer sees the game, their interpretation of the violence in it, and how it fits into this bigger context of Palestinian resistance and freedom of expression. But what does all of this mean for us, the listeners?
That's the key question, and we'll be tackling that in the last part of our deep dive. We're going to think about the ethical and historical questions that this review raises, and we'll explore how games can offer different cultural and political perspectives. Stay with us.
All right, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Fursan al-Aqsa and that really thought-provoking review. I gotta say, this whole conversation has been, well, a lot to process, a mix of emotions and ideas.
Yeah, it really pushes us to think about some uncomfortable truths and maybe question what we thought we knew about history, religion, even video games and what they can be.
I keep coming back to the reviewer's insistence on seeing everything through their identity as an Eastern Christian. It's not a perspective we hear much in the usual discussions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
You're right, it highlights how there are many different perspectives and experiences within this conflict, and sometimes those caught in the middle, their voices aren't heard as much.
That part about their interpretation of the Wailing Wall, based on how they read the Gospel of Matthew, that really stood out to me. It shows how differently history can be interpreted, how much depends on your beliefs and where you're coming from.
It's a good reminder that history isn't always objective. Even things that seem solid, like physical structures, can be seen through completely different lenses, leading to very different conclusions.
And then there's the whole debate about violence in video games. It always gets people talking. Fursan al-Aqsa definitely pushes those buttons, but the reviewer says its over-the-top style makes it more satire than a glorification of violence. What do you think? Can humor or absurdity ever really neutralize violence in a game?
That's a tough one. I think it probably depends on the person playing the game itself, the whole context. This review at least starts a conversation about those things, about the responsibility of game creators, and how we as players should think critically about what we're playing.
I think it's key to remember that context is everything. A game like Fursan al-Aqsa, made by a Palestinian creator and dealing with this very specific political situation, it's going to be interpreted differently from, say, a typical shooter game set in some made-up world.
Absolutely, and to understand that context, we have to be open to viewpoints that challenge our own ideas, even if they make us uncomfortable. This review, agree with it or not, it makes us consider a perspective we might not have otherwise.
It also gets me thinking about games as a way to make social commentary. We often see them as just entertainment, but they can also be used to express political ideas, explore historical events, and even challenge the prevailing narratives.
Games can be a really powerful way to build empathy, to let players step into someone else's shoes and experience the world from their perspective. Of course, that comes with responsibilities. Game creators have to be careful about the messages they're sending, and players need to be critical about what they're consuming.
It all comes back to critical thinking. This whole deep dive has been about that, challenging us to question our assumptions and engage with a perspective that might feel unfamiliar or even a little unsettling at first.
Exactly, especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with information
Hmm.
and misinformation. Being able to think critically and engage with different points of view is crucial.
So as we wrap up, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from this?
I'd say it's this. Don't shy away from challenging your own assumptions, look for different perspectives, and use games as a way to learn and reflect. You might be surprised by what you find.
Well said. This deep dive has definitely made me think differently about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how religion shapes worldviews, and how powerful games can be in expressing different cultural and political views.
And hopefully it's done the same for our listeners.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going.